They don't call the Chinese inscrutable for nothing. At the best of times, it's hard to read what's happening in Beijing. But at the moment, a combination of several events has created what seems like a mystery. Why are the incursions in Ladakh continuing when President Xi has assured Mr. Modi the troops would withdraw? What does President Xi mean when he asks his army to prepare for regional war, but also to show absolute loyalty to the government? Why has our army chief cancelled his visit to Bhutan? And does this mean it's time to be concerned about developments in Chumar and Demchuk? To shed light on these questions, my guests are former Army Chief General Shankar Roy Chaudhary, the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times and a member of the National Security Advisory Board, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, the diplomatic editor of the Hindu, Suhashini Heather, and the Beijing correspondent of the India Today group, Anand Krishnan. General Roy Chaudhary, let's start with President Xi's instructions to the People's Liberation Army to improve their combat readiness and sharpen their ability to win a regional war. As a former army chief, do you think this is directly or indirectly connected to the aggressive incursions presently underway in Chumar and Demchuk? Or would that be an exaggerated conclusion?
Look, an army has to be prepared for border wars. As far as China is concerned, it could be a border war with India over Ladakh. Though frankly, I think that possibility is a little low given the general tenor, the cheerful tenor of the meeting between the Prime Minister and President Xi. And but there are other places where China is at more of a rivalry, and prime amongst them is Japan, also Taiwan, also Korea. So when the President and the Commander-in-Chief of the People's Liberation Army of China says to be prepared to fight a regional war, it could be India, it could be any of the others. But in any case, it's a standard exhortation given by all commanders-in-chiefs to their armed forces, and it is there. In any case, we should be well prepared for all contingencies. The old adage we must follow, speak softly but carry a big stick.
In other words, you're saying we can't afford to be dismissive of these remarks, even if we shouldn't be worried by them. Have I understood that correctly?
That's correct. That is correct. We should take them in, we should take note of them, and keep our preparedness up to scratch.
Anand Krishnan, alongside asking his army to be ready for a regional war, the Chinese president also demanded absolute loyalty, and he asked that decisions of the central leadership should be fully implemented. Xinhua, the Chinese news agency, says the president told top PLA generals, and I'm quoting, PLA forces must have absolute loyalty and firm faith in the Communist Party of China, guarantee a smooth chain of command, and make sure all decisions from the central leadership are fully implemented. What do you make of that? Why suddenly does he insist on loyalty unless he's got a problem with the fact that maybe people aren't loyal?
Yeah, Karan, I think there are two different aspects to what he said. One is about the regional wars, and the second is about loyalty. I think about the first part of the statement, I've been surprised that too much has been made of it, I think, in the media reports out of India that I've seen, for two reasons. Firstly, I mean, this is a phrase that's been used by the PLA since the late 1980s, since the early 1990s, and it's something I hear every time the head of the Central Military Commission meets the PLA. There's a reference to winning local regional wars. It's more a reference to their doctrine, and it's not something that's aimed at a specific country. And the second reason is that I was told that Xi's meeting with the chiefs of staff was something that was scheduled a long time ago, and before he even went to India. As for his call for loyalty, I think that's more interesting because in the last few months, Xi's been waging a pretty unprecedented corruption crackdown in the military. And we hear many reports here in Beijing that there are a lot of people in the army who are upset at what Xi's doing. I think this was more something aimed domestically because I think Xi is ready to promote two generals who are very close to him, and there's some opposition to the promotions. So I think that's something more aimed at internal politics.
Okay. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, Analysts in India have pointed out that President Xi is not just president, not just head of the Communist Party, he's also chairman of the Central Military Commission.
Yeah.
He's clearly, many people believe, the most powerful leader China has had since Deng Xiaoping.
Yes.
So analysts in India wonder, is this insistence on loyalty and the full implementation of orders a reflection of the fact that the assurance he gave our Prime Minister 6 days ago that the incursions would cease and Chinese soldiers would be withdrawn has not been fulfilled? Is that somehow playing at the back of his mind, or are Indian analysts jumping to the wrong conclusion?
Yes, there is an argument that he is having difficulty controlling the PLA, and that perhaps what happened was happening in Demchok and Chumur was an independent PLA action designed to embarrass him, but I would doubt that. As you've mentioned, he is the head of the Chinese Military Commission. He is the personal loyalty issue is something that he has said before, and I think Anant is correct that what it implies, that what it's really about, is the fact that he is undergoing a major shakeup of the PLA brass within. PLA has a severe corruption problem. It has a severe bureaucracy problem. It is a highly bureaucratized, politicized system, not particularly good at fighting wars by some accounts. And he is now moving to remove a number of senior generals and put in at least two key princelings that are close to him, Lui Yuan and Shang Yao Sha, both of them who are hardcore reformists but come from the same background that he does. In other words, they're children of key Communist Party members. Now, obviously, when you're going to do something like that in an organization as powerful PLA, you can expect a degree of some sort of a backlash. And I think that's what he's really talking about when he says this. I don't think India is part of that.
So, Ashni Heather, I want to focus for a moment on the assurances President Xi gave Prime Minister Modi first in Ahmedabad, then in Delhi last week. There are reports that when in fact Prime Minister Modi raised the incursions, the Chinese president actually said that he was puzzled by the developments. Thereafter, it's now clear that even 6 days after he gave an assurance that Chinese troops would withdraw, they haven't. And once again, there is speculation in India that there seems to be either dissonance or a disconnect between the president and the PLA over the incursions as well. Do you A, agree with that interpretation, and B, if you do, how serious is that apparent dissonance or disconnect?
Well, Karan, I will defer to Anant, who's on the ground there in Beijing, as to exactly what the meaning of President Xi's remarks while he was in Delhi to Prime Minister Modi, as well as what he has said to the PLA yesterday, and what exactly they mean. I do think that when it comes to the India-China context, we do have a tendency to run towards non-corroborated reports, and I say that very carefully, because I don't quite understand why the situation in Chumar, which had been building up for a week before President Xi's visit, actually flared up right when he was here. Was that purposeful on either side? Was the Prime Minister not aware of what was happening? And does that put paid really to the gloss that we've been hearing from both the Ministry of External Affairs as well as from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, that in fact India and China are on the same page, that President Xi and Prime Minister Modi were able to resolve their differences, build a consensus is the word they've used on how to go forward on the boundary resolution. The reason I'm bringing all of these up is because the perceptions are so different between Delhi and Beijing that we haven't even got to the heart of what was the real problem. Is the problem, as we have been saying, just the build-up? Did the build-up begin right as President Xi arrived in Ahmedabad? Because for about 4 or 5 hours, we saw the two leaders live on television, walking together, speaking for hours together, first at the Sabarmati Ashram, then at the riverside.
Sure.
Where did it all go wrong? And that's the real question I want to ask.
Anand, I want to focus a little bit upon those incursions, not the background and the build-up, but I want to focus on the present situation. Reports in today's papers suggest that in fact the incursion in Chumar has moved up a notch or two in the last 24 or 48 hours. The reports in the Indian papers say that the Chinese have pitched tents well within Indian territory, and they've also rushed in a sizable number of troops. Some accounts even suggest as many as 1,000. Is this, from your standpoint, becoming a more serious incursion than previously thought? Or is this just the way incursions go? And does the reportage vary depending upon which paper you're reading and what analyst you're hearing?
Are you speaking to me?
Anand, can you hear me?
Hello?
Anand, can you
Hello.
hear me?
Yeah, hi, Karan, I lost you.
Did you hear that question, or shall I put it again? I was simply saying that there are reports in India that suggest that the Chumar incursion has built up a notch or two in the last 24, 48 hours. There are reports of tents being pitched deep into Indian territory, Chinese troops being sent in by some accounts, maybe even as many as 1,000. Does this suggest that the incursion is worse and more serious than previously thought? Or is that just how incursions go, with reports varying depending upon which analyst you talk to?
Yeah, I think it's playing out in a very similar way to what happened in April last year at Depsang. And I think what the Chinese military is saying that, well, what we're doing is on our side of the line of actual control. And as far as we are concerned, we haven't violated any of the agreements we've signed with India. So I think, like the situation in Depsang, it will probably take a while to get resolved. And it will need something of a face-saving compromise that will allow the Chinese military to withdraw and not be seen as giving up the ground that they've covered.
Okay. Something, General Roy Chaudhary, that's added to a measure of concern, I don't want to exaggerate it, but something that's added to a certain measure of concern is the sudden decision taken by the army chief to cancel his visit to Bhutan virtually the night before his departure. Now, I know that army headquarters insist that this is not in any way connected to what's happening in Ladakh, but many people feel there needs to be some sort of connection. And as a former army chief, I want to put two questions to you. Do you, A, think that the cancellation of the visit to Bhutan could be connected to what's happening in Ladakh? And secondly, if it is, does it suggest greater concern on the Indian side than we are officially being told about?
Well, there will certainly be a fair degree of concern in army headquarters at any Chinese build-up, any unusual Chinese build-up or any unusual Chinese movement in a particular sector which has not seen any such movement over the last months and years. And that is a good time. I think the chief himself may have thought of it, or maybe the government said, look, there is something happening, it's best that you stay back. So maybe that was the reason why the chief put off his trip abroad. So I think it is a precautionary move to have the command element in place, including at the highest level, just in case this movement with a neighbor, with a powerful neighbor, with whom our relations appear to be on the surface normalizing, but we don't know yet. So I think it's a safety measure. They have taken steps to keep everybody in place. And what we also hear in the media, of course, that there's a buildup of Indian troops.
True.
There's a corresponding buildup of Indian troops to back up our border defense forces. As you know, the border is held by the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. These are being backed up by regular troops. So I think these are standard measures which are being taken just in case things get out of hand, though I will say at this stage the possibility is not very high.
Pramit Pal Chaudhary, I'm quoting not from your paper, the Hindustan Times, but sadly from your great rival, the Times of India. Their front page today spoke of Indian soldiers making what the paper called a tactical retreat in Chumar. But the paper didn't seem to explain how significant this retreat was or what its implications are. Now, someone who's a strategist and follows events very closely, has such a retreat happened? And secondly, how significant is it?
I'm not too worried about the retreat, quote unquote. Very often soldiers have to realign their lines of position to more defensible ones, or sometimes if they feel that they are being outflanked by an enemy posture where soldiers are moving to their flanks left or right, they then have to realign themselves, and that happens quite often. So I don't know the specific details of this, but I wouldn't be too worried about that. I think what Anand correctly said is the problem is the face-saver issue. This happened at Depsang, and it has happened before. When the Chinese decide to push a little beyond their border, their normal border incursion games, and then get themselves into a position where the Indian side then begins to feel it has to escalate in response, the question then is, how do you retreat? Because Chinese culture is very much based on this issue of not losing face. Most militaries have this anyway. In China, it's doubled because it's built into their culture. And in Depsang, we had to eventually, demolish some obscure little places of our own to give them the face saver that would allow them to walk back. I remember when I've talked with Vietnamese, for example, who've talked about the South China Sea dispute, they actually also mention that they always have to put in something that they can sacrifice to the Chinese in the face-off so that the Chinese have a face-saver. The problem right now is I don't think that the Indian side is really prepared to give them a face-saver, and it is not clear what that face-saver is, because as long as both sides are still moving troops in, the face-saver becomes all that more difficult to get out of.
So the corollary or the conclusion to your point is that things could get a little worse, or maybe a lot worse, before they get better.
And they could drag on for quite a while.
So Ashni Heather, I want to build on that point that you've just heard from Pramit Pal Chaudhary, but sadly, once again, I'm not going to quote from the Hindu, your paper, I'm going to quote from your rival, the Express. The Director General of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, Subhash Goswami, has told that paper, and I'm quoting, "We have asked our men to be aggressive, and this is the reason we are involved in a number of standoffs with the Chinese in the past 3 months." And then an unnamed Home Ministry official has also told the paper, "We have been asked not to lower guard, and no de-escalation will take place from our side." This is a major shift in the government's stand from our earlier times when we were asked to retreat. Does this suggest that, in fact, it's not the nature of the Chinese incursions that's changed, so much as India's response to them? And this response in turn suggests that far from giving the Chinese the face-saving they need to retreat, we're actually doing the opposite.
Absolutely, Karan. I would agree with you. I think the way the Indian Army has responded, or certainly the security forces have responded, seems to indicate that they are doing differently what would otherwise have been a standoff at the LAC. Even the reports that have come out are indicating that for every Chinese soldier who is part of that standoff on what they perceive as their side of the line of actual control, there is an equal number of Indian soldiers as well. What you are quoting from the Indian Express is something that is well understood, that they have been ordered really not to stand down. And I think you have to look at what Prime Minister Modi himself said in that press conference. In a major departure from what we normally hear about the India-China peace at the LAC sort of situation, we heard Prime Minister Modi almost suggesting that unless there was peace at the LAC and the border between India and China, bilateral relations between the two countries could not progress. Now, that's certainly the first time I've heard that construct being used with China. Remember, we're speaking about the LAC. This has been a peaceful boundary for 20 years and more. This is not, in fact, in this standoff. You know, we use these very powerful words like incursion and standoff at the LAC, but we have to remember that there are no shots being fired, that there's no weapons involved, that this is essentially a territorial argument, if you like, being played out with physical bodies over there, but none of them are getting aggressive to the point that one would say perhaps see on our other boundary with our other neighbor. So I do think you're right that there is a shift, not just in the position up at the LAC, but in the words of what Prime Minister Modi said. I think we have to look at them very closely. And then the question has to be asked, Karan, are they having a different impact? Are we seeing a different reaction coming from China, given that, on this side, certainly there is a new way of behaving?
General Roy Chaudhary, there's limited time left to this. I want to try and pull together our discussion. We're really just talking about straws at the moment, but there are several of them. There's President Xi Jinping's comments, there's the Times of India story, there's the Indian Express story, there's even the army chief cancelling his visit to Bhutan. And you have suddenly 4 or 5 different straws that are all seemingly ominous. And then secondly, I say to myself, when something worrying develops, it usually begins with being straws in the wind. Taking those 2 points together, as a former army chief, what's your assessment of the position we're at?
Well, I think there is something strange going on in China. These incidents about Chumar, etc., these are incidental. Why is such an event happening at a time when the President of China himself is visiting India? There is something strange going on. Is it something on the part of the Chinese army to do down the President at his, because the President wants to have good relations with India? The Chinese army or elements in the Chinese army do not want that to happen. They are showing up their own president. There is certainly something strange going on.
Okay.
Because it is happening at this precise time when the President of China has come to India on a very obvious goodwill visit. I think we'll have to wait and watch, because there is something going on inside China between the army and the political leadership, which will have to be watched very carefully.
Okay.
It is really very strange.
I know you say we have to wait and watch, but Anand Krishnan, you and I are journalists, and journalists don't like waiting and watching. We like instant answers. I read in today's Times of India again a comment made by an unnamed government source who says it's simply not possible that the PLA would flout the orders of President Xi. And this source was suggesting that there could be some sense in which China is playing a double game with India. Now, you're sitting in Beijing, you know the Chinese, you follow them closely. Is there any credibility to that fear that the Chinese are playing a double game and misleading us? Or is this just a government source talking through his hat?
No, I think, Karan, it's absolutely a bit of a mystery, in the sense that in the 2 days that we've had after Xi came back to Beijing, I think there's a huge sense of disappointment among Chinese officials when they speak frankly of how the visit went. I think they saw it as an opportunity, and the way the focus went to the boundary issue, this was an opportunity that was lost. So I think there's a huge sense of disappointment at how Xi's visit went, especially after 3 or 4 months of build-up that they've had in Beijing. But at the same time, I think I would be cautious in the narrative that Xi is losing control of the military. I think part of the lesson from the 2-day meeting that he had in Beijing with the chiefs of staff was to send a very strong signal that he is very much the man in command.
Okay. I don't have time for a long answer, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, but I want you to give me a short, sharp one. One of the concerns when one looks at this situation from the Indian side is that we don't really know what these straws in the wind add up to, but people say to themselves, do they suggest that we're not being told the full truth? Is there more happening, which for whatever reason, understandable or not, the government isn't sharing with us? Or am I jumping to an unjustified, perhaps alarmist conclusion?
I would say simply this. One of the things one has to keep in mind about the LOAC on our border is that over the past 5 years, there's been an unprecedented amount of infrastructure building on the Indian side. One of the consequences, I was on the Sino-Indian border myself recently in Ladakh just a few weeks ago, and what is striking is that now our patrolling, for example, is now much more effective than it was before. Where 2 men used to go every week, we now have 5 men in a jeep. The same is going on obviously on the Chinese. It's a perpetually shifting game now on the border. Now, if a new norm is being developed or evolving on the border, we need therefore to negotiate a border agreement that incorporates all of this into it before some accident may happen.
All right, that's certainly a lesson for the government to heed. Very quickly, Svashni, I want to ask you the same question I asked Pramit Pal Chaudhary, and also ask you for the shortest possible answer. Do these straws in the wind justify the concern that some Indians have that perhaps we don't know the full story, that perhaps there's more happening than we have been told about? Or are those just unjustified concerns? A quick answer.
Well, absolutely. And Karan, as I've said earlier on this show as well, that I do feel we're not getting that full picture. And if you look at the official statements, they're so far removed from what we are hearing off the record. And the reports and the photographs and the videos that are coming in, that there is a need for more transparency from the government as to what exactly is happening in this region where no journalists do have access. And I agree with Pramit there that such a situation makes itself more prone to what he referred to as accidents, and between India and China, certainly not something we can afford.
And remember, when journalists don't know, they don't hesitate to speculate, and speculation can come to conclusions that may be the truth, but they may be wide off the truth. And so that's another lesson for the government. Brief us and tell us, and through us tell the country. It's always the best way of winning trust. Of course, I don't mean to suggest that the government is actually hiding anything. It's just that people are speculating with so many straws in the wind that are there things we aren't being told. My thanks to all 4 of my guests for joining me, and there we end this particular episode. If you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.